Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar featuring ethnographic research segments illustrating real people discussing why DEI efforts are more than just a nice to have. Today's presentation is being given by Ipsos qualitative research experts, and you'll be able to read more about them on the slide in front of you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, April Jeffries, President of Ipsos's Global Ethnography and Immersion Specialty. April, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So, welcome everyone to our discussion today. I actually added this slide relatively recently because it is the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Now, I will be perfectly transparent with you. Hip hop is not my favorite genre, okay? And I love music, but I never really got into it. But I will tell you this, the reason why I think it's an important thing to bring up today in the context of this discussion is because it is the perfect example of what we're going to talk about today. These young people found a niche that they loved to play in. They found a place to express themselves, and what they had to say was very, very different than what anybody else was saying at the time. It started out as this fringe kind of thing that only the people who knew. And all of a sudden, look at how huge this industry is. It has touched every category. I read somewhere it was a $50 billion industry. That's a number that I think is something that we should pay attention to. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about people who live on what we're calling the vibrant fringes, not necessarily in the middle, not in the average, but outside of that. And that, in my opinion, is where we will find some of the most forward-thinking innovation and communication strategies that we will ever find. And it's been proven historically, and I believe it's how we will be moving into the future as well. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about this idea of the vibrant fringes and identify what is the real opportunity that's there. We're going to give you a unique peek into some real people. We're going to hear from their very own words how it feels to be in these fringes and what that even means today, because I will tell you, the meaning of that is shifting over time. And then lastly, we're going to give you some tips about actually meeting the needs of the people on the vibrant fringes and what you might do to be able to capture some of this opportunity that we've been thinking about. So let me first start by saying, let's all take a step back and remember that every business problem is really a human problem. Right? Every data point that we are analyzing and every spreadsheet that we get is actually trying to capture some form of human behavior. And I think it's important to remind us of that because I don't know about you, but I fall into that sometimes, right? We get so caught up in our business questions that we kind of forget that all of this pretty much boils down to the human. But I thought it would also be interesting to give us some context about how some of these things are changing, right? I have a quote here that says, we're not in Kansas anymore. 61% claimed to be non-Hispanic white in the population of 2016. What is projected by 2060 is that number is going to decline to 44%. That's a huge decline in what we are considering now the average. 85% of Americans are saying global or national brands need to play a role in solving global problems. That's a huge percentage of people that are looking for something different from our brands. And Gen Zers in particular say that they will stop using a brand if its stance on equality doesn't align with their own. So let's look at the changes in the population. People who claim to be multiracial, no, not yet. Sheena, if you can go back. People who claim to be multiracial used to be 9 million people said it back in 2010. It has now increased to 34. So, I mean, this is not small changes that we're talking about. 1 in 4 adults in the US claim to have some type of a disability. 1.5 times the affluent African Americans are 1.5 times more likely to spend, and Hispanics now make up $2.5 trillion in buying power. So we've got some shifts happening amongst people, and I will argue that even the way I've categorized people in these numbers is changing and is shifting. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. I mentioned earlier this idea of the vibrant fringes. And what that means is there are people who we have considered to be on the edges of things. We used to call it the margins, people who are marginalized. It's not the most positive way of thinking about it, but as we were talking, we thought, you know what? Okay, we accept that these people are on the fringes. They may not be what's in the middle and the average, but there's some vibrancy there. There's something there that they are going to bring us that we would not otherwise have seen. And given some of those numbers I saw earlier, they're moving in to the middle. They're not necessarily going to stay on the fringes. So it would behoove us as organizations, as businesses, as brands, as categories to start to recognize that now early. Get in and start talking to people in the way that they are looking to be talked to. So brands of the future can't play in these averages anymore. They're changing. They won't be the average for the long term. You need to reclassify how you talk to them and who you're talking to. And we need to work on this bell curve, right? What's it going to look like? And I suspect it won't be one bell curve. It's going to shift. It's going to spin. It's going to be a kaleidoscope of averages and fringes and people who move in and out. So it's very important to understand how that's going to happen and what to do about it. So I speak a lot here about empathy here at Ipsos. And the more I look at what we're talking about here, I just can't not bring this up. Empathy is our body's most important weapon, if you will, to feel what other people are feeling and to understand what's important to them, so that to the extent that we can help to develop that, make that more of a real sixth sense that we use every day, it will only make us that much further ahead when it comes to dealing with people who live in these vibrant fringes. The way we define empathy here at Ipsos is the ability to think what someone else thinks, to feel what someone else feels, and to do the things that someone else is doing. And sometimes that means to not be able to do the things that someone else is unable to do. So it is literally being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Got it. But there's a second part of this that's very important, and that's about now that you've done that, step back out, add and create value for people by using your own resources, by using your own history, your own experience with what it means to be othered. Take that, combine it with what you felt when you were living in someone else's space, and use it to create value. That is how we have defined empathy, and that's what we train a lot of companies and organizations on how to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheena, because what we decided to do was try to step into some of these people's shoes, right? What does that look like? And Sheena's going to talk you through some of the people we spoke to and some of the things that they said. Sheena?
Hi, I'm Sheena. I'm an anthropologist with the U.S. Ethnography Center of Excellence, or ECE. And the ECE led this study. It was a 2-week multimodal digital ethnography. We recruited 12 participants from all over the United States and who represent a range of intersectional identities. Part of what happens when you do ethnography is you step outside of some of the more structured environments and you get into people's real daily lives. What that means is that not only did we have our 12 participants, but by extension, we had a look into and some insight into people who are connected to their daily lives, including multiple generations of their families, partners and significant others, friends, and anyone who kind of weaves their way in and out of our participants' lives. You'll notice that there's no key demographic information on this slide. We just have our images. And that is because we wanted to let our participants describe themselves in their own words as a way to introduce them to you. So we have a film we're going to play. Pardon me in advance if there are any technical difficulties. We will get back on track if there are.
Here's me in special education. I'm autistic. Whether it be for good or bad, like it does affect me. And like it's important that people know that, because if I say something that's offensive or makes them uncomfortable, I had to be like, oh, sorry, that was not my intention. I have this intellectual disability. It gets in the way.
I identify as an environmentalist and a crafter and Japanese American. Belonging, it's like never feeling like you quite belong. I've like resolved some of that internal turmoil in a few different ways. I think part of it is having like other mixed race friends to be like, oh, the identity is mixed.
Well, my mom is Black and my dad is Japanese and white. My dad being like half white is sometimes confusing for people because like when you say you're mixed, they want you to be like, oh, I'm this and this. But like when your parents also mixed, they're like, okay, I'm confused.
My dad more so is kind of the more like, I'm American, I'm white, you know, like he talks, I mean, he even will mention like, oh, we have Spanish blood in us, you know, and it's like, it doesn't really matter to me. I feel like I have a lot of pride in being Mexican American, you know. I'm American too, like, I'm a part of this culture, but I don't necessarily think that means I have to identify as white.
I identify myself as a Black polyamorous woman. So what it means to me is that we should be making space for all people to love anyone the way that they choose. It goes into me being an ally for the LGBT plus community. It goes into me being an ally for my Muslim friends who may practice polyamory, right? So that's what it goes into me whenever I identify as a Black polyamorous woman.
I'm a Black woman. I was born a Black woman. I'm going to die a Black woman. So I'm always going to identify as a Black woman who just happens to love another Black woman. I think some people make it more of a defining point in their life. Like I have a cousin that you can see her house from a mile away because she got rainbow flags and all that, you know, everything she got on is a rainbow. When I go to work and I take care of my people, I'm just fair. I'm your nurse, you know. Sometimes everything is not for everybody.
I think it was based on where I felt what needed to be shouted the loudest. So I'd be in spaces, a lot of spaces that weren't queer. And so it was very important to me to make sure people knew that I was queer. There's queer people in this space. Yeah, I'll identify as queer, identify as Iraqi and Chaldean very strongly. The rest sort of like is secondary.
Awesome. So, what did we hear right there? Well, for me, what really stands out is we used to think in such duality, right? We used to think of people as one thing or another. And what I've heard from how these wonderful individuals introduced themselves, how they identify, it was more than one thing. You never heard anyone just say they were Black, white, whatever. It was always a mixture of things, and it was always somewhat situational. Bashar talked about how, you know, so it depends on what's most important for me at the time, what needs to be represented. There were some people who wanted to be authentic, but didn't feel the need to do that all the time. You know, she talked about how I'm a nurse. When I go to work, I just want to be a nurse, right? So I think it's important to understand these vibrant intersections that are happening. They will have very different expectations based on that. Their experiences have been different, and we're going to show a lot more about what kinds of things they have been experiencing. But this idea of vibrant authenticity, in my opinion, has shifted. It has become something that is somewhat contextual, somewhat situational, and all of that is real. All of that is valid. So I'm going to take it to Sheena again so that she can talk to you a little bit about how we at Ipsos have started to think about these intersectionalities.
Thanks. At Ipsos, we have an inclusion council. And they rely on the expertise and experience from employees at Ipsos across our many different service lines, with a purpose to push forward on the design, the recruitment, and the way that we conduct analysis on the people-based projects that we do here at Ipsos. Many of our clients, and Ipsos as well in the past, would rely on two particular lenses when looking at people, and those were race and gender. But if you think more carefully and more intentionally about who we are and who the people around us are, if you expand your scope, it's amazing what you'll find about how people live, how people can live, and how they think about how they live. So looking at these 6 dimensions that we have identified, we've created more space. Going through them again, it used to be race and gender, and now we're looking at race, color, and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, life stage and generations, religion and nationality, ability and disability, and social class and other factors. And that can include caste, that can include socioeconomic status. But what you'll notice is that every one of these dimensions includes more than one element. So what you're doing is you're allowing for a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of who people are. And so building on the first film that we just saw, we wanted to show you how people identified who they are. And now we'd like to let them share a bit with you about the different experiences and impressions that have led them to understand themselves and their intersectional identities.
In terms of like a mixed race Japanese character, I still don't have like a great TV role model. So I think I was led to believe that being like blonde and white was the way that you are the main character.
The first time I remember being discriminated against was in kindergarten. I was talking during like a lesson with my friend on the rug, and I remember being the only one that got in trouble. And it was a Friday, and on Fridays we got lollipops, but the teacher didn't give me a lollipop, and she gave the other girl that was also talking during the lesson a lollipop, who was, of course, white. I was one of very few children of color in that classroom.
Well, I do know the fact that my parents identified as Jewish, no problem. We celebrated Hanukkah openly. You know, nobody made reference to the fact that there could be something wrong or perceived as wrong as being a Jew until we got to Indiana. And then immediately everything changed. The area that we lived in was, you know, very white. My mother suddenly was the one that refused to admit that our family was Jewish, started warning me about letting people know, but the cat was already out of the bag. It was too late. Because the little girl told me that I was personally responsible for killing Jesus.
We're here cooking breakfast here with my grandmother. Cooking some sausage, grits.
I've had some situations where, you know, I've just been targeted just because of the color of my skin, just point blank period. You know, one time I was driving, I was in high school. I was going the speed limit. And I remember the police officer, he pulled me over. There was a car that flew past me. And I'll never forget, they were, you know, it was a white guy. And he pulled me over and I was like, what did you pull me over for, sir? Like, you know, I'm going the speed limit. He said, one of your lights was out. And I mean, I said, that's fine, sir. But I was like, did you not see the other car that was speeding? He was like, oh, no, that, you know, this is more important. So, you know, that was just a one case of I saw where I just knew what it was.
So let's talk about that. What they were describing was their lived experience. And I think there were some things in there that were pretty consistent. And to be honest, I feel like there are things that we all might be able to relate to in some sort of way. I love this quote from Alice Yu, who is the VP of Consumer Insights at Tapestry. She said, "I'm Asian, I'm American, I'm a woman. In different moments, I want to express myself a little bit differently. And our consumers also have multiple facets of themselves that they want to express." So how do you capture that? And how do you start to recognize some similarities as you go through this? Some of the things that we heard as we were listening to those people describe their lived experience was, this notion of being othered, of being treated differently. And it was clearly something that you felt and you knew it was going on, although you might not know the real reason why it happened, but you felt it. This idea of microaggressions, we've talked about that a lot, right? How does it come across? How come some things that may not even be intentional, but people take it in a certain way, like, that was a little bit of a slap at what you just said to me, right? This idea of uniting and finding surprising communities that you didn't even know you were a part of, or you didn't know were formed already, was kind of a neat thing that was coming out of this. One of the silver linings of being on the fringes is that you had people who connected with you in a very different way. There was appreciation for individuality. And what we heard, not just in those videos, but in some of the other people we spoke to, is that once you've sort of felt that way, that it was kind of there was an appreciation that you gained for other people that may feel that way, even if that's not your experience. So that's where the whole empathy thing comes in. You start to recognize what that feels like and what it feels like to have someone address that in a way that makes sense. There was a lot of talk when we spoke to people about this idea of polarization that is happening now in our country in particular. And again, it seems based on this duality that is sort of kind of going away, right? And then this idea of history, and can we rewrite it in places that we don't feel necessarily good about it? Or how do we deal with it? Or how do we make sure that things that happened in the past that we don't want to happen again don't? So these are some of the things that they have talked about in their lived experience. Some of it not necessarily surprising, but certainly some of it, hearing it from the mouths of people who are experiencing it does something a little bit different in terms of how much empathy you can have for people.
And so now what we would like to do is let our participants have the opportunity to tell you a bit about how the experience that they have had have shaped their beliefs, shaped the way they feel about the world, and the kinds of things that they're hoping for in the future.
What you see here are the academic achievements of myself and my entire family. Education is really big in my family.
I'm a realist. I realize that if you're coming from a marginalized society, it is going to be much harder for you to work your way up. But I'm still a firm believer, unless you can rap or play ball, your greatest ability to do so is through education.
There was like this like understanding that you just have to work hard, you have to earn your keep, you have to like don't accept handouts. Even the idea of like collecting unemployment or collecting food stamps, even though my family has been like recipients of those things, it was like shameful. So that was a bias that I had. And I think over time, I've grown to realize that that's all bullshit, right? And, these systems, like we pay into these systems exist for a reason. And actually, these systems aren't even helping the people that need it the most.
I wish I would have been proud of who I was in my culture and like they're like, oh my gosh, like they love tamales and they're like, let's have tamales for lunch. And I remember like my mom would, in my little Minnie Mouse thermos, like put like tamales in my lunch and I'd like be at lunchtime, like kind of like eating it, like hiding it. And my girls are just like, my friends know what it is. Like we bring it all the time.
I like the direction for the most part that the newer generations are going. I feel like a lot of them are very vocal. I see this in my little sister who's, she's about to turn 18. There was an interaction specifically where my little sister, she wanted to wear a suit instead of a dress to prom. And for some reason, my mom had like huge issue with that. And I think, it comes from that traditional side of, Hispanic trying to show like hyper masculinity or femininity, right? My sister definitely has more of a tendency to present as someone who is like a more masculine, I guess, in terms of how she dresses. And I told her, like, it's totally fine. I'm happy that you stood up for yourself. So she ended up going to prom in the suit.
I didn't expect people to give me overwhelming jump up and down support for my multi-ethnic family. Just give me respect. I respect everybody until I'm given a reason not to. It's insane to me that people will just randomly drop an N-bomb or something about gender or something about sexuality. It's just like, I'm not here for any of that.
So he's not here for any of that. I think it's important to hear what they think and how they're feeling right now. And this idea of authenticity is interesting because it actually led to freedom for them, right? Even if they realized, I don't have that yet, but boy, I'm so glad to see my younger sister or this younger generation who are approaching this totally differently. It feels different. It feels good, right? We heard them challenge the whole American story and the American dream and what that means and what that looks like and what we should be aspiring to. We saw that people on the fringes know how to protest and they will pull out all stops to do that. And if you realize that today, how we protest is very different than what we did back in the 60s, but we still protest. And when someone doesn't like what's happening, there are a multitude of ways for them to sort of bubble that up so that it is heard. Individual authenticity, what we're seeing, is good for everybody. And they realize that. So this is not a zero-sum game in their minds. This is something that if you let me be myself, I can make things better for everybody. The pie will continue to grow if we allow people to be their authentic selves. And most importantly for this conversation, people, is that they all felt that businesses can and should play a bigger role in how we make these changes moving forward. So for example, you'll see, this is a study that we did in our social values research, but you'll see that 57% of the people we asked say that it is appropriate for any brand or industry to communicate their stance on equality issues. And if you break that down into Gen Zers in particular, the number goes up significantly. But of that 57%, 95% of them said not only is it appropriate, but they expect it. They expect brands to take a stand on issues that they feel are important. It's not just a nice to do to them. This is something that they feel brands should be doing, could be doing, and if you're not doing it, you're going to hear from them. So given that, let's hear from them a little bit more.
Okay. As April just said, they expect more. They know companies can do more. And in recent years, with the growth of activist movements, with Black Lives Matter, Stop AAPI Hate, the call for more representation in the media for trans people, for people with disabilities, they saw a lot of steps forward and things that were implemented. And they also saw a lot of what they see as lip service, which you'll hear in the video, coming from the companies that they engage with. And they want people to recognize that they have become more aware and more purpose-driven in their lives, which includes what they do, what they buy, and what they want. And here we have some examples of them telling us about what they've seen and what they want to see.
People have started to realize, like, hey, like, how are the extremely dark-skinned women doing? Are you guys able to find colors, foundation shades? And the answer was no. Nobody, in the makeup community really cared too much. I will take any opportunity I can to purchase their products because just did such an excellent job of making sure that there was a wide foundation range for people of color, with people with darker skin tones.
This is a company that, in my mind, I've battled back and forth with, having a type 1 diabetic son due to their cost of their insulin. When you talk about exclusion, we have to look at socioeconomic status for people as a method of exclusion. And when you have a medication that people who take it needed to actually live and can't afford it, we have to look at a company that provides this medication and is well aware of the fact that a good segment of the population can't afford their medication. And the fact that has taken the stance and recognized and addressed this problem and lowered the cost of their insulin to $35, which is obtainable for a lot of people, I think I have to give them their kudos when their kudos is due. They recognized that they are part of a problem, addressed it, and fixed it.
I don't think I know of any companies that are doing a good job with DEI. I don't see any tech companies having like a proportionate amount of Black, Indigenous, Latinx groups. I just don't see them in those places of power,
There were some moments I felt heartwarmed when in certain companies that I may have supported make a bold statement and say, that type of mentality does not belong, or we don't represent that. At the same time, I was always thinking this is all about money. I've kind of lost my belief in companies who need to do everything they can to keep themselves afloat.
These are all capitalistic enterprises. I don't expect them to not want to make money, but whatever their social impact vision is needs to be in alignment with them making money, and they need to be like together. The impact that the entity is trying to make, the social impact, is a part of its core values and is a part of its mission. And I don't see very many companies doing a good job of that.
Okay. And just to kind of, I think Bashar at the end of that film says it really, really well, that, wanting the core values and the mission of the company to match with their social impact, it really illustrates what people are looking for and what our participants are looking for. In terms of going back to earlier in this presentation, the 85% of people that April mentioned earlier who identify as more intersectional, we received so many bits of data. We had so many exchanges with our participants that illustrated this that we weren't able to show you in these films. But I have just a small list of some of the topics that came up in our conversations in terms of corporate accountability and the responsibilities of the companies that that people do and do not want to support. And this is just a small range. So going from climate change, environmental injustice, sustainability, inequities in healthcare, livable wages, issues of homelessness and access to housing, biases in hiring practices and corporate policies, bias and exclusion in the media, including that of race, including that of gender identity, including that of body type, including that of sexual orientation, to bias and exclusion in the consumer goods area. Who are things designed for? And I think at the beginning of the film, Amaya was mentioning foundation, colors of foundation for people who wear makeup, and just having access to something that actually matches your skin tone being included. So this is not something that people who work at Ipsos came together and brainstormed about what are all the things that might be important that people are thinking about. These come directly from our participants. These are the kinds of issues that they're thinking of, from something as kind of broad and large as environmental injustice, pollution, climate change, to something that they interact with more directly in their daily lives, how they choose what they're going to buy, if there's even something for them to buy that speaks to them and that is made for them. So going back also to the Alice Yu quote from earlier, where she said, in different moments, I want to express myself a little bit differently. I think a lot of us are familiar with the concept of code switching, when you change your cadence, your tone, you can change your accent, you can change the vocabulary that you're speaking, and that has to do with who you're interacting with. And it's a concept that people now know. It's a more normal thing. It's something that we do because we possess different aspects of ourselves, and those different parts of ourselves come out based on what we are doing at that moment, what we're acting, who we're talking to, what we're thinking. People are consumers, they're customers, they're patients, they're employees, they're community members, and all of that changes how someone feels in the moment, how someone engages in the moment, and what someone needs and expects from others. So in addition to the idea of code switching, we think there is a bit of a subjective kind of personhood and identity switching that is happening, that people are more aware of in themselves and are asking for more accountability from companies. What they want is a revised stakeholder accountability, something that does not just take into consideration the needs, the wants of their shareholders, but also saying that the stakeholders include the community, they include consumers, they include employees, and having some consistency through different levels of a company that show and align with, again, as Bashar said, the core values and the mission of those groups.
So I'm not sure if any of this is new news. I think it's certainly been a wonderful reminder to me as I approach how I talk to people and I approach my business objectives. But let's talk about what we can do about it, right? So we have some tips here that might be helpful in terms of when you're thinking about inclusion and what to do about it. We say we should innovate from the margins, right? Let's talk to them. Let's get the ideas. Let's see what they're doing to make things work when they don't. And then design for the masses. And we're going to have some examples of that when we talk about some specifics that companies are doing. This idea of approaching people in the margins with a real cultural understanding mindset. So much of the decisions that people make is based on context. I've come to believe that just about everything is based on context. It's about where you are at the moment. It's about what you are in comparison to things that are happening around you and how that makes you feel. This idea of intersectional experiences, I think we've talked enough about that, but it is key. And I think to the extent that you can really bring those to the forefront, people start to believe, you get me, you understand what it is I'm going through. This idea of listening to their voices and amplifying what it is they're saying is a big one. How do we give them voice? And if anyone has experienced that, where you've been talking and you've been saying as best as it can be said from your perspective, and then someone else says it, and it opens up another path or another group of people who may hear it. Those are the kinds of things that real allyship do for you. And even better, open up that door so that I can come in and say it to this door that you've opened for me. And the idea of making strategic choices and sticking to them. I do get some questions about alienation of consumers and what does that mean for people who don't necessarily agree on a stand that you've taken. You have to be strategic about this. You have to understand who your consumers are. You have to do your research, quite frankly, and you have to know what your risks and rewards will be. But there's ways to do that, and there's ways to do it so that you come out better than when you started. So let's talk about some of these strategies. Right now, what we have seen, and this is some work we've done in our advertising and consumer communication areas. Executionally, a broad representation of different people, including underrepresented communities, is great. It's table stakes. Doesn't mean that much. Referencing cultures and contexts that include these underrepresented communities is really good, and it's better than just the representation. It shows that you know something about what it is this group is experiencing. But as we start to get even more strategic about that, it's important to start to really be insightful for what it is you're seeing. It goes beyond just the representation and the reference to what you're seeing. There are dynamics that happen within these intersectional places, particularly for these underrepresented communities, that if we can find the insight that really resonates, just like any other kind of marketing, that's really what's going to push us over the edge. And then lastly, how do you actively advocate for inclusion and societal change, which, as we saw earlier, is something that is becoming more and more expected of brands to do. So let's take a look at some brands that have done that. So Nike has introduced a hijab that is now a groundbreaking product that they took a risk in doing. There were some people who had some issues with it, but they addressed a whole nother segment of the population that needed it. They needed something to work out in and still be able to represent what they wanted to. So it's a great example, and it has been an incremental business for them on top of what they do. This idea of Fenty Beauty, and one of our people talking in there, she actually said this, but we had to bleep it out because we're not allowed to do that. But I'm telling you, between us, it was Fenty that she was talking about, right? Rihanna has come in and she has created a $2 billion industry all by her little self that just said, I understand women of color. I understand the variations of women of color, and I'm going to really create products that address that, that address dark-skinned women, light-skinned women, and the myriad of things and people that we are dealing with when it comes to makeup for people of color. And then the Apple Watch, I love this example because when designing the watch, the Apple actually went to people with disabilities, right? And they designed all this haptic stuff that we now do, that we feel on our wrists throughout the day. They did that based on what people with disabilities needed in order to be able to know when they were getting texts or messages or things that are important. That has become something that we all use and we all look for. So it has become a design element that we might not have even thought about if we hadn't talked to people on the margins in these vibrant fringes, right? So let's just keep making sure that we keep this idea of empathy front and center, right? Understand the needs and the wants of people that are living outside of our necessarily, ordinary lives. Share those needs and want what's best for them, want to be helpful, want to add value. If you come with that from a very genuine place, it reads. It reads in the things that you do and the things that you create. And then act in a way that makes lives better. We have access to resources. We have access to products. We have access to ideas that we can bring to people in order to be able to help. So in summary, what does this mean for marketers? You need to nurture this empathy mindset as you're looking at people within these vibrant fringes. Know that you have the right information and act with empathy with that information. And again, do your homework, do your research, whether that's secondary research, whether that's talking directly to people. Know what it is your consumers are thinking, and know what it is the people on the fringes are thinking and feeling and saying. And explore how to fine tune your brand so that it can meaningfully resonate with people, so that you're saying the things that they understand and the things that they want to go do. So there's my little bit of selling that I'm going to do. I do it shamelessly, but we do have an empathy program that we do here at Ipsos that we start with just training organizations on, let's come back to what it means to listen to people, what it means to have real empathy. And it's not that we're bad people. It's just that we're caught up in our business lives and what it is we're trying to do. We've got to make a number for the month. And it does help to go through just a couple hours of, let me just sit and remember what it means to empathize with people and think about it. Now, this quiz that we have right now, you can use it, use your little QR code to scan in on that. Our quiz is actually more about organizations. Think about how your organization is set up now. Do people react with empathy? Do you have enough programs that really make sure that you are truly consumer centric, which I hear a lot, but don't necessarily see as much as I hear. So take the test. We'll be sending you guys an email that's got this in it as well. So hopefully there's ways that we can help you to get back to that if that's what you feel you need. So what are some of the key takeaways before we wrap this up? Number one, the world is changing, whether we want to admit it or not. It is. There are shifts that are happening, not just in the demographics and geographics of things, but also in attitudes and the way people are thinking about it. Strategies for the future really have to acknowledge that, and they have to address what's happening, and you got to get ahead of it, because if you do it after it's happened, it loses some of its meaning, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is these communities that have traditionally or historically been underserved are what we are calling the vibrant fringes. And they have a very special ability to reveal and expose things that we would not necessarily see. There are incremental growth opportunities in there. And one of our respondents actually said, well, yeah, I'm heartwarmed by it, but sometimes to me it's all about money. Well, you know what we found is that people get it. They get that it's about money. They know that that's what we're here to do. But if I'm going to spend my money, let me spend it in a place and with a brand that knows who I am and who respects that and who tells me that they respect that. So don't hide from it. Find your niche, find the thing that you're going to represent and use it. And there is incrementality if you do that in an authentic way. And then lastly, this is about listening. And we've got AI coming, and it's going to make everything super easy in terms of boiling things down to the summary and the most efficient way of thinking about things. However, deep listening to real people in real life is different. Even listening to people in a video is very different than being with them as they're making the decisions, being in their homes, seeing what it is they're struggling with, understanding their context and what is happening around them. These things are all very genuine experiences that I believe face-to-face contact with people sometimes is what we need to do. And I think we've forgotten how to do that. So, we are more than willing to help reestablish that kind of thinking again, especially when it comes to these people who are residing in what we've been calling the vibrant fringes. So that is our presentation for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We don't have time for questions, I'm sorry, but we will get back to you, I promise you. If there are any questions, to just put it in the chat, or again, we'll be sending out some follow-up communication. Please reach out to me or Sheena directly. We are more than happy to address whatever questions or concerns or future ways forward that you may want to talk about. So thank you again,
Thank
and
you.
have a wonderful afternoon.